Welcome to this Gearwig video tutorial on line of sight. Many aspects of Warmachine require a model to have line of sight to another. Ranged attacks and magical attacks require line of sight, as well as charges and slams. Any effect that requires a target requires line of sight. An effect that requires you to select a model does not require line of sight. A model can draw line of sight to another model as long as you can draw a single, straight, unblocked line from the front arc of a model's volume to any part of the other model's volume. In this video, we'll discuss exactly what constitutes a model's volume and what game elements, like terrain and other models, can block a line of sight. Every model in Warmachine takes up a three-dimensional space on the board. This space, or volume, is determined by its base size and has nothing to do with the model itself. A model's volume is a cylinder whose width is equal to the width of its base. The cylinder's height is determined by the base size. Small base models, like our Stormsmith Stormcaller on the left, have a volume whose height is equal to 1 3/4 inches. Medium base models, like the Firefly on the right, have a height equal to 2 1/4 inches. Large base models, like Dynamo in the middle, have a height equal to 2 3/4 inches. The Privateer Press Spray template has a helpful gauge on it with these exact heights listed. We can see on the left here a helpful arrow labeled small, showing us exactly how high the Stormsmith Stormcaller's volume reaches. Similarly, there are labels for the other two base sizes as well. Remember that line of sight can be drawn from any point in the model's volume to any point on the other model's volume. So if a potential target's base is obscured by terrain or some other sight blocking effect, you may still be able to target them if you can draw a line to the upper part of their cylinder. Aspects of the model itself that are outside of its cylinder, like Dynamo's spear on his right or even his gun on the left, do not count as part of the model when determining line of sight. Strictly use the cylinder dimensions to determine whether or not you can draw line of sight to or from Dynamo, or any other model. And lastly, while it won't show up on the spray templates gauge, Colossals and other huge base models are considered to be 5 inches tall. All three-dimensional terrain effects block line of sight. So if our Firefly wanted to target one of the other models here, he would need to draw at least one single line of sight from his cylinder to the other model's cylinder that didn't pass through a terrain piece. On our left, we can see Bradagus peeking out behind an obstruction. While most of his cylinder is obscured, it is possible to draw a single line of sight from the left part of our Firefly's cylinder onto the small exposed part of Bradagus' cylinder. Since we can draw that single line of sight, we can then target him with attacks. The Wold Watcher on the right is partially obscured by that wall. We can't see any part of the Watcher's base, it is completely obscured. But we can easily draw a line to the upper part of his cylinder, from the upper part of our cylinder. So we can draw line of sight to that Watcher, and thus we can target him with attacks as well. If a model were completely obscured by that obstruction I placed, such that we could not draw a single line from our cylinder to his at all, then we would not have line of sight to that model and would not be able to target it for any attacks or effects. And look! There was another Watcher hiding behind that obstruction the whole time. What a surprise. He was out of our line of sight. Other effects can block line of sight as well. These effects will have explanations in their rules as to how specifically they do that. One of the most common line of sight blocking effects is the cloud effect. A model outside of a cloud effect cannot draw line of sight through a cloud effect to a second model also outside of that cloud effect. So, if a cloud effect were placed here on the left, it would block off any potential line of sight we could have to Bradagus. Any lines of sight from our right side would be blocked by that obstruction, and any other line of sight would be blocked by that cloud effect. Since we can no longer draw any legal line of sight to Bradagus, we cannot target him with any attacks, spells, or effects. When you are attempting to draw a line of sight from one model to another, and that line passes over the base of a third model, that third model is considered an intervening model. Some intervening models will block line of sight, while others will not. This is determined mostly by base size. When a model attempts to draw line of sight to a second model, it can ignore any intervening models whose base sizes are smaller than the second model. It treats those models like they weren't even there, and can draw line of sight right through them. For example, if Nemo here were trying to draw a line of sight to the lowermost Wold Watcher, he could not possibly do it without drawing a line through one of his rangers. That wall of rangers there blocks any possible lines of sight to that Wold Watcher. But the Watcher is a medium-based model, so Nemo can ignore small base models when drawing line of sight. He can ignore his rangers that are standing in the way, he can draw line of sight to the Watcher, and he can target him normally. If he were instead trying to target the lowermost Wold Stalker, he could not possibly draw a line to that stalker that didn't pass through a ranger. Since the ranger and the Wold Stalker's bases are the same, Nemo cannot ignore them when drawing lines of sight. They block his line of sight, he cannot see that Wold Stalker, and thus cannot target him with attacks and effects. If Nemo attempted to target Bratagus on the far right, he could ignore all the small base models standing in a line in front of him. Even though they block a line of sight, he can ignore those models because they are smaller base than Bratagus. He can also ignore the Wold Watcher in the middle of the board. He's a medium base, a smaller base than Bratagus's, so he can ignore them when drawing line of sight. The only circle model he can't ignore is the Wold Warden out front. So while that Warden would block line of sight, Nemo is able to draw a line from the lower part of Nemo's base, below that Warden, through the Wold Watcher, through the line of small base models, right to Bratagus. So Nemo can draw line of sight to Bratagus, and he can thus target him with spells and effects. Note that which intervening models you are allowed to ignore when drawing line of sight is based solely on the model you're looking at and his base size, not the model you're looking with. So Dynamo, who's in the same spot as Nemo, is going to be drawing the same lines of sight. He can see Bratagus as well, because he could ignore the same models that Nemo could. When Dynamo tries to draw a line of sight to the Stone Stalker along the bottom, he runs into the same problem as Nemo. He can't draw a line that doesn't pass through a ranger. He is not allowed to ignore these rangers for line of sight, because the model he's attempting to look at, the Wold Stalker, is also a small base model. It makes no difference at all that Dynamo's base is large. It doesn't affect your ability to ignore other models. There are many other additional special effects in the game that may cause a model to not block line of sight. Dig in is one of the most common. When a group of trenchers dig in, along with their defensive bonuses, they also do not block line of sight. They do not count as intervening models, regardless of what other model is trying to look through them, regardless of their base size. The special ability Dig In makes it such that they never block line of sight. Stealth is another common ability that affects line of sight. When drawing a line of sight through a stealth model that is more than 5 inches away from the origin, that stealth model no longer blocks line of sight. So, as soon as a model is far enough away to gain the stealth bonus, which is to say the bonus that forces attacks to miss, it also stops blocking line of sight. So, even a big, large base, stealthy nightmare, for instance, won't block line of sight if he's far enough away. You can see right through him, through the stuff behind him. Elevated terrain can affect line of sight in 2 basic ways. A model attempting to draw line of sight to a second model can ignore intervening models if they are more than 1 inch below him, unless they are within 1 inch of the second model, the model you are attempting to draw line of sight to. Additionally, you can also ignore intervening models that are 1 inch below you and within 1 inch of the target you are looking at, as long as their base is equal to or less than the base of the model that is doing the looking. That got pretty confusing pretty quick, so let's use some examples. First of all, we'll use my turned over dice tray as elevated terrain. we'll consider this more than an inch off the table. Let's assume our little wold stalker, our little small base stone shrimpy dude, is trying to draw line of sight to the Stormsmith Stormcaller along the bottom. There's no way he can draw a line to that model that doesn't go through one of the other Signar models clumped up in front of him. But since that clump of models, that Firefly and 2 Rangers, are more than an inch below him on the terrain, and not within an inch of the model he's trying to look at, the Stormsmith Stormcaller, then we can ignore them. Even though the Firefly's base is larger, even though there's no legal way to draw a line that doesn't touch one of them, we can completely ignore them, because they are both 1 inch or more lower on the terrain and not within 1 inch of the target we're looking at. So we can draw a line to the Stormsmith Stormcaller and target him with attacks. If instead our little stone shrimp tried to draw a line of sight to Nemo, there is no way he could do it without passing over Dynamo's base. Dynamo is an intervening model. Dynamo is more than an inch below us on the terrain, but he is not more than 1 inch away from the target we are looking at. He's clearly within 1 inch of the target we are looking at. In that case, we cannot ignore him as an intervening model. So we cannot draw a line of sight through Dynamo to select Nemo. Our little wold stalker cannot target Nemo with attacks or effects. If our big wold warden tried to draw a line of sight to Nemo, he would similarly be unable to draw a line that didn't pass over Dynamo's base. Dynamo would be an intervening model. Dynamo is still more than 1 inch lower than us on the terrain. He is within an inch of our target, Nemo, but since his base side is equal to the size of the model that is doing the looking, which is to say the Wold Warden, then we can in fact ignore him for line of sight purposes. When a model is below you on terrain at least an inch, and his base size is equal or smaller than yours, you can ignore him as an intervening model, even if he is within 1 inch of the model you are looking at. So our Wold Warden, in this case, can draw line of sight to Nemo, and can target him with attacks and effects. Determining line of sight in Warmachine is a fundamental task required for all ranged attacks, magical attacks, and charges. It's normally easy enough to do, but in times when it gets complicated, remember that a line of sight must originate from the front arc, it must pass from any part of one model cylinder to any part of another, it can't pass through terrain, and it can't pass through intervening models that aren't specifically ignored by the line of sight rules. Thank you for watching. For more tutorials, battle reports, and articles, check out Gearwig.com. You can email me at boss@gearwig.com or check out our Facebook or Twitter pages. If you want to help the site, tell a friend and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you.